Okay, this is how the webinar flow will be. We will begin by asking the big question, of course. Is liquid cargo contamination really such a big issue? Because we believe it is, and in a few minutes we will share with you some statistics which will demonstrate this. We will look at some of the most common causes and what can be done to reduce the likelihood of occurrence, and perhaps more importantly, what steps we can take to protect ourselves and ensure that we have the best defense should a claim arise. Before we go on to the main topic, the panelists will briefly introduce themselves. We will begin with our expert, Ivan Todorov, who is a guru when it comes to tankers, chemicals, and oil. Ivan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. I'm a qualified master mariner with 5 years command experience on crude oil product tankers. And before joining Brooks Bell in 2014, I spent 16 years at sea and 4 years of post-fixture and commercial operations, mainly with dry and liquid bulk cargoes. I'm also a qualified navigation assessor and internal ISM ISPS MLC auditor. I have achieved a Master of Science in Navigation and Master of Business Administration in Shipping and Logistics. I normally advise clients on a range of marine incidents, such as liquid cargoes, disputes, navigational maintenance and operational matters, as well as casualty investigations and assessments. I have provided litigation support by preparing expert reports and acting as an expert witness in arbitration proceedings in the UK.
I was previously a lawyer doing shipping litigation in Singapore. I'm with North in the Singapore office for the last about 10 years doing claims for P&I.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Andy Glenn. I've been with the club for 14 years now, the majority of that time spent working in the loss prevention department. The last 2 years of that based in the Singapore office of the club. Prior to that, I was a lecturer at the deck department at the Scottish Nautical College for 7 years. And prior to that, I spent 16 years at sea on a variety of vessel types, including bulkers, container vessels, and passenger ro-ro vessels.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Catherine O'Connor. I'm a lawyer here in the FD&D department of the Singapore office of North. I've been working there since 2014, and before that I was a lawyer working in private practice.
Thanks, Catherine. Although Catherine is not going to be an active participant, she has agreed to join us in case any of the participants have a legal or FD&D related question. And last but not the least, me, Andy Desai. I suppose over a period of my 6 years here with North, I have met many of you. I work with Andy Glenn in the Singapore office's loss prevention department. I've sailed for 18 years on tankers and bulk carriers before moving to Singapore in 2008. Right, we're going to begin now, and I'm going to ask Andy Glenn to now take you all through some statistics which will prove beyond doubt that the issue of cargo contamination is indeed a serious one. Over to you, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. These are just a few high-level statistics to help put the discussion into a little bit of context and demonstrate why we focused on this particular topic for this presentation. This particular graph gives a percentage breakdown of the number of tanker claims that Ben and his colleagues are managing on a daily basis here at the club. The data set is for the last 5 years of tanker claims, and over that period we've seen more than 3,000 claims, 900 of which are cargo related. Now we can see from this graph there's a pretty even split between cargo shortage claims at 33%, that's the blue section of the graph, and cargo contamination claims at 39%, shaded purple. But that's really only half the story. If we move on to the next slide, this is the real reason why we chose this subject for the webinar. This graph shows us the breakdown of cargo claims by cost, and hopefully you will all recognise that by far the most expensive type of claim we see is cargo contamination. with more than 60% by value of all tanker claims attributed to contamination, compared to just 14% by cost for shortage claims. And this last statistic slide shows the number of liquid contamination claims over the last 5 years on a year-by-year basis. And you can see that despite dealing with this type of claim for a while now, the number of incidents remains pretty consistent. And from a loss prevention perspective, this is a little bit disappointing, as it appears to show that we don't seem to be learning from the mistakes that we're making, and seem to be struggling a little bit to get on top of this type of claim. Over to you, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. And there's been, quite a lot of talk and discussion internally within the club on liquid cargo contamination claims and the causes. And the causes that we are going to look at today, they're not exhaustive by any means, but they are the ones that we see commonly. And there is some good news. Some of them are relatively simple to fix. So the first topic that we are going to talk about is contamination arising from segregation. I'm now going to throw the ball in Ivan's court. Ivan, in your experience, do you see a lot of contamination claims resulting from segregation? And if you do you often get involved in these type of claims?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Yeah, unfortunately, this type of cargo claims was one of the biggest I have dealt with during my career with Brooks Bell. And I'm sure our audience may have been well aware about the term double valve segregation. But for completeness, I will just mention what this one means in technical terms. And this is where two valves work together to provide segregation during all stages of the cargo carriage. This is during the loading, during the voyage, and during the discharging, including the final stripping. Particularly, double valve segregation should be ensured during the stripping with the use of automated unloading systems, stripping pumps, and cargo adductors. Double valve segregation can be also achieved by positive segregation, such as the use of blind spectacle flanges and, of course, pressure test of this arrangement. The integrity of the valves is not always tested or planned, in my experience, and the periodic cargo line pressure testing is different from the cargo valves integrity testing. A valve integrity should be verified separately from the other valve in the pair, because if both valves are tested together in the closed position, some leakage or passing of one of the valves may remain undetected, and this will compromise the double valve segregation arrangement. We should bear in mind segregation between cargoes may also require the vapors or IG lines to be isolated as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ivan. I mean, since we are on the topic of lines and valves, I would like to perhaps make another point here. It's a very basic point, but it is with regards to familiarity of the lines and the valves. On product and chemical tankers, as we all know, there's a massive number of pipelines on deck, and it must be made mandatory for everyone involved in the cargo operation to know and understand how the cargo flows from the tank to the manifold, what valves the cargo passes through, and the different types of valves that are involved. You can use mimic boards to train yourself, such as the one that you see on the right-hand top corner of the slide here, so that they can understand the system well. It's quite a simple approach, but I think, in my opinion, it is the best way to understand the pipelines and valves. Ivan mentioned pressure testing. I think what we don't see sometimes is an actual pressure test just before loading or discharging operation. I think it's quite important to do that, and also to keep records of this. You can still have double valve segregation, but if you have two tanks which share the same line between the tanks in the manifold crossover, then you still can have a problem with contamination. Ivan, what do you think?
Yeah, these are all very valid points, Andy. Some company safe management systems do provide for pipelines pressure test as well as valve integrity testing when double valve segregation will be required. Basically, newly joined crew must familiarize themselves with the ship's equipment before they start using it. And we are talking about cargo, mooring, navigation equipment, etc. This is also very much augmented by the element of mentoring on board.
Yeah, I mean, haven't we all heard in the recent times about mentoring and how it is important and how it doesn't happen much nowadays? Yeah, valid points, Ivan. Thanks very much. Another issue we experience often in the P&I club is the commercial pressure put on vessels with single valve segregation to sometimes load incompatible cargoes against a letter of indemnity. in order to maximize either the commercial returns or the availability of the cargo. And I'm quite certain that Ben and many of his colleagues have seen and handled such claims as well. Ben, anything you would like to add here from a claims perspective?
Yes, Andy. I think the starting point is that the vessel is obliged under the Hague and Hague-Visby rules to carefully load, stow, carry, and care for the cargo on board. Charterers' instructions to load and carry incompatible cargoes with single valve segregation potentially breaches the integrity of the vessel design and increasing the risk of cargo contamination. So for that reason, the owners will often ask for LOI. Whether to accept this or not is a commercial decision for the owners, as the LOI might potentially replace the P&I cover. As such, when considering whether to accept such LOIs, members will need to consider the credit risk of the party providing the LOI as well. I think also we need to recognize that although the master and the crew are supposed to be expected to be familiar with the Hague and Hague-Visby rules, the reality is that they are often not that familiar with their rights under the Hague-Visby rules.
Interesting. Thanks, Ben. I wish to make one more last comment before we move on to the next slide. With regards to any contamination claim, when documents are usually sent to us in loss prevention for review, we usually see very sparse information, in the plant maintenance systems or the checklists that are provided to us. We basically see it's limited to dates or a yes and no answer. Pretty much, what we call as a paperwork exercise. We very rarely see any commentary or description to understand what was really done. The next cause of contamination is relatively brief. We have seen contamination claims on vessels with hydraulic deep well pumps. Now, as you all know, with a deep well pump or a Framo pump in this case, a large portion of the actual pump is within the cargo tank. So Ivan, can you briefly explain how hydraulic oil from pumps could contaminate the cargo?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Well, with deep well pumps, the segregation between the hydraulic oil in the cargo and the tank in the tank is limited to 2 seals only, and just a cofferdam between these 2 seals. So when both seals fail, hydraulic oil may contaminate the cargo, and the cause for that can be obviously poor, inadequate, or insufficient maintenance, but it can also be the cargo itself. Just for example, sulfuric acid will cause an increase of the wear off of pump seals.
Well, so that means it is important to keep an eye on these seals all the time, and also be particularly aware, if you've got a cargo like sulfuric acid, that could be really detrimental for these seals.
Yeah, and there is a way to monitor this one, and I think everybody may be familiar with the term purging as a way of preventive maintenance. So when purging is done according to the manufacturer's instructions and records are kept accordingly, a trend analysis of the purging result can then be done. And this is quite important when it comes to deep well cargo pumps.
I think, when I've studied a few of these liquid cargo contamination claims, I think people generally are, when I say people, I mean seafarers, they are generally quite good at the purging routine, and we generally do see them quite well and comprehensively filled out. But the important thing, or a point that I would like to make here, is the ability to interpret results and perform a trend analysis, as you say. It's very important that purging is not done only as a paperwork exercise. People should understand that there's a reason for doing it, and it's important that these results are analyzed. Well, the picture that you see here on the slide is that of a Framo pump, but there's other types of deep well pumps as well. Ivan, is there any place that members or crew can even go to get help in interpreting this trend analysis?
Well, the crew should normally be quite good in this. It's important that the results are interpreted objectively. Sometimes it is quite difficult to make a distinction between an allowed and excessive leakage of cargo and or hydraulic oil, for example. Some specific cargo such as naphtha or condensate, they may normally result in an increased leakage per day. Other cargoes, for example, vegetable oils, they may not result in such big leakages. So it's important to understand what has caused the increase of the leakage. Of course, the cargo pump makers can always be consulted and asked to assist, provided that there is sufficient quantity of representative and accurate records to show them. So from a maintenance perspective, sending periodically cargo pumps low boil samples for analysis ashore is also important.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things to be looked at, isn't it? And one more thing, I've already said this before, and I'm going to say it many times today. One more thing I'd like to add from a loss prevention perspective. When you do a pump inspection as is required by your plant maintenance system or as per the manufacturer's instructions, please try and add as much as commentary as possible in your plant maintenance system records or your checklist, whatever you use, to describe accurately what's going on. If your procedures allow it, take pictures. The point being, the more information you have, it will mean better evidence for the future in case of a claim.
Thanks, Andy. Now, we all know the tank condition can be a key contributor to contamination, and we've seen our fair share of these in the past. Ivan, perhaps you could explain a little bit about the different types of tank coatings and how they behave differently.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Well, the cargo tank coatings, they just evolve continuously, and for these reasons, we have employed coating specialists who are able to deal with cargo tank coating as well as hull coatings. And as the table here in the slide shows, certain coating is more suitable for specific products than other type of coating. It is quite important for the crew to be really familiar with the cargo resistant parameters of the coating. For example, if a vessel is loaded with methanol, there are a limited number of days when this cargo can be stored in epoxy coated cargo tanks, and also there is a need for the coating to cure before more aggressive cargoes are to be loaded. So as it is also noted in the slide, the coating may absorb moisture, cargo, and also can retain this for a certain period of time, while this is not the case with stainless steel tanks. So the stainless steel tanks may be constructed of solid stainless steel or with a few millimeters of stainless steel cladding, and they can carry very aggressive cargo such as acids. For this type of tanks, roughness and passivation levels are sometimes the parameters, some of the parameters that are to be monitored. Some other issues with the stainless steel cargo tanks that come to mind is the discoloration from fluoride vapors, for example, or the so-called elephant skin.
Okay, thanks very much, Ivan. Just moving on to the next slide, and the horror show photos that LP departments across all of the clubs are becoming quite famous for. Of course, these are very good examples of very bad coating conditions. Ivan, what do you make of these images?
Yeah, these are quite interesting photos. To me, this suggests a certain level of failure to inspect and maintain the tanks. Good tank coating allows a bigger variety of cargoes to be carried, and everybody knows that. A failed coating is unlikely to affect the quality of crude oil, for example. However, this may not be the case when we talk about clean petroleum products and chemical materials. Coating may retain previous cargoes and moisture, and as we already mentioned, and periodic inspections in this respect, record keeping, raising the awareness about the cargo to be carried is again a proactive approach in preventing potential contamination claims.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ivan. I think another key loss prevention message here is to take every opportunity to enter a tank in order to inspect the condition and form an accurate report of the inspection. You know, in these pictures, the damage we see didn't happen overnight. So good practice suggests that we keep a rolling record of tank inspections, showing the condition of the cargo tanks. Quite often we see tank inspection reports that say just good, 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 and then all of a sudden it looks like this.
Well, yeah, when a vessel carries high-value clean petroleum products or chemical cargoes, for example, entering a tank for mopping is basically done every time before the loading. And the question here is how much attention is paid to the condition of the coating during these entries. Well, of course, samples of the damaged coating itself can be helpful in a way.
Yeah, I mean, we've recently written an article on this, not just for tankers, but for industry-wide planned maintenance systems. Excellent form of evidence, and possibly a little naive to only check when planned maintenance schedules require you to do so. Get in there if you have unplanned maintenance or other reasons to access and create a good commentary. Get good photographs, it all makes great evidence. Ben, if contamination were to occur, any thoughts on the resolution from a claims perspective?
Yep, Andy. If the cargo arrives at the discharge port contaminated and the load port samples are on spec, then it is usually going to be an uphill task defending the claim. We then have to try to settle on best possible terms depending on the evidence available at hand. So this includes considering whether the cargo can be downgraded instead of a distressed cargo salvage sale, whether there's any way to blend or reprocess the cargo to bring it back on spec, or at least for less of a downgrade to be made. Things to try to mitigate the value of the cargo. So in this respect, we often work very closely with cargo scientists, such as those from Brooks Bell, as a lot of this is all very, very scientific.
Okay, good stuff. Thanks, Ben. Just moving on to the next slide, and on to tank cleaning. We see plenty of this type of claim coming through to loss prevention. Ivan, what are your thoughts on how we can improve cleaning?
Well, with respect to improving the cleaning, the industry has already developed over the years quite a good knowledge database to assist the vessel operators and crew in this respect. Online assistance and various literatures are available, such as the Dr. Verwil Guide, Milbros, Chemsurf, the major oil companies such as Shell, BP, and others. They have developed their own tank cleaning metrics. Another area is the Energy Institute, Intertanko. They continuously update their guidelines as well for tank cleaning of product and chemical cargoes. We all know that tank cleaning can be quite time and resource consuming activity, and unfortunately there are no shortcuts for this. It is good not to overdo it, but of course it is not good when it proves to have been insufficient, and then we have a claim to defend.
What about tank cleaning machines, Ivan? Can you share your thoughts on them and maybe comment on what the important factors are with regards to these machines?
Well, yeah, I mean, the tank cleaning has become quite complex, particularly with the use of cleaning agents and liquid cargoes, not just oil product, but chemicals and vegetable oils. They will require different cleaning approach and medium. What I can say is just know your tank cleaning machines, whether they are portable or fixed, single or with double nozzle, whether they are programmable or not, and how they can be programmed. Nowadays, there are machines that are designed to do the Marple Annex 2 pre-washing cycle at a completely different pitch and speed. So basically, a full tank cleaning can be done pre-washing can be done in 5 to 10 minutes. So pitch, pressure, and temperature are some of the key elements, of course, that are often overlooked during the tank cleaning process. If you don't get the proper pressure right, then you will not get sufficient contact with the bulkhead. The incorrect temperature can result in cargo residues. Equally, and this is something that can be overlooked or miscalculated, when people are tank cleaning, keep your tank top or the bottom of the cargo tank as dry as you can during the process. One way to establish if the tank cleaning machines are working correctly is to go on deck, and this is just the normal seamanship. Stay on top of the tank being washed and just listen to the water that is bouncing off the bulkheads, which is generally quite loud. Sometimes you can even decide to time the rotation and look at the above deck driving unit, how it performs. I've come across a few cases where the documentation for the tank cleaning operation ran into almost 10 pages with timesheets and everything. And in that particular case, the documentation was actually quite helpful to prove that the vessel itself cleaned her tanks properly. Yeah, this is the proper proactive maintenance of tank cleaning machine is also quite important. We should not forget that there is some kind of leakages that may appear, and spraying of about maximum 2% from the nozzles is not unusual. But if this becomes quite excessive, then the pressure reduces and the efficiency of the tank cleaning process also reduces.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're back to evidence again, aren't we, to show that you're doing things properly. Things like standing on the deck, as you mentioned, and listening are very basic, but they're also not always seen as routine tasks. So often, we see cargo operations being conducted entirely from within the CCR, whether it's tank washing or loading or discharging. It's really quite important to get out, get a physical feel for what's going on deck. It's not a video game, and the crew need to be in contact with what's going on. Ben, anything you would like to add from a claims perspective on that?
Yes, Andy. From a claims perspective, the tank cleaning is only as good as the records you keep. Following a claim, you can very quickly make out whether the record was kept without the cleaning because questions will be asked. So that is why the more details are kept on the records, the better it is. You know, the 10-page tank cleaning records that that Ivan was talking about just now is an example of that.
Sure, thanks. Okay, moving on to the inspection of tanks then. We see a lot of claims come across the desk saying that tanks are clean, when in reality they're just not. Ivan, what have you got to say about the sort of testing done to confirm that a tank is clean, rather than just looking at it and saying it's clean? Are you involved in this? Any problems in this area?
Well, yes. Well, the tank inspection regime will depend quite a lot on the cargo to be loaded. For example, crude oils and dirty petroleum cargoes do not usually need any tank entry, and tank draining, simple tank draining may be sufficient. However, some clean petroleum products also may not need tank entry, but others, sensitive cargoes, will most likely require tank entry to verify that the cleanliness and readiness of the tanks, pumps, and also cargo lines is okay. Whether wall wash test or ultraviolet spectroscopy analysis is used or should be used, as long as the crew has done due diligence to wash and prove the readiness of the tank, I just do not see what else they could possibly do. A tank entry for inspection must be supported by a proper enclosed space entry procedure, of course, because no surveyor will enter a tank without this be followed. If a tank is not ready for entry, then the only way to inspect is from the deck level, and this is not always sufficient to prove the tank readiness. And in this respect, the crew must be ready with the tank entry to facilitate the inspector in port. Let's not forget the inerting. If inerting is required prior to loading, a tank entry can be done at anchorage if the surveyor can attend.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. We also see quite a few comments that a wall wash test is only as high in the tank as the height of the person that carried out the test. Maybe a 6'5" person could sample a little bit more of a wall than somebody else. But I mean, do you agree that this is basically what we've got?
Well, this is all the ship crew can do. I cannot expect the crew to start building any scaffolding in the tank just to check the condition of the higher parts of the bulkheads. If the tank cleaning equipment is maintained properly and the cleaning method is adequate and properly supported by records and evidence, then what is the likelihood to have clean lower parts of a tank while the upper unreachable levels are not clean?
Yeah, we often get people stating that they've seen clean tank certificates when no tank entry has been made, and quite frankly, all they've done is open the hatch, used a torch, looked in and said that the tank's clean. And that's just not evidence of a clean tank at all. You may not necessarily need a wall wash test on every occasion, but getting down into the tank and being able to run your fingers along the bulkhead to see what residues there are, whether there's any sediment at the bottom of the tank or the wells, it's up close and personal. It's not only good evidence, I think it's important evidence. And partly that's because for every tank entry, there would be a tank entry permit. And that's one of the things that we ask for, is supporting evidence to show that tank entry was done. And then so often, these permits can't necessarily be provided.
Yeah, well, it's not only the visual assessment that can be made, but also the presence of odor from previous cargoes or tank cleaning chemicals used. Well, entry in the cargo tank prior to the loading of expensive high-value petroleum products and chemical cargoes is quite important.
Okay, thanks very much, Ivan. Over to you, Andy.
Thanks, guys. Some interesting discussions. So essentially, we've looked at segregation, the contamination arising from segregation. We've looked at the contamination arising from hydraulic oil leaking out of the deep well pump, and now we've looked at tank cleaning. Before I move on, can I just suggest, if anyone has any questions, I've already started the chat. In case anyone has any questions, please do type your questions in there. We already have a couple of questions, and we will address these at the end of the webinar. Thank you very much. So moving on to kind of the final, but one of the bigger causes, which is off-spec cargo. And Ivan, I think we all know that sampling is very important, but can you briefly touch upon the purpose of taking samples?
Well, when we talk about liquid cargoes being loaded through pipelines in tanks, how far are the master and the crew expected to go when it's about annotating the bill of lading, for example, in good order and condition and clean on board? The master cannot be expected to know whether certain cargo is within or out of specification unless the material can be visually observed and there is a change in the color, haziness, and presence of particles. The change of other characteristics such that can be only analytically established is not within the crew competence or knowledge.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more, Ivan. Thanks. Let's now look at the importance of sampling. And to begin with, perhaps I'm going to throw the ball in Ben's court this time to ask him how important sampling is, Ben, in the event of a claim.
I think samples are very, very important. The samples provide a snapshot of the quality of the cargo at the point and time that they are taken. One problem we sometimes see is that while the office may have procedures in place, if the crew are reluctant, unsure, or perhaps just not careful when taking or labeling the samples, then the system will fall apart.
Yeah, I've seen that so many times. Ivan, you've been in the surveying business for long enough. Do you experience sometimes reluctance of the crew to get involved?
Well, it may happen, but actually quite seldom nowadays. The crew must know, the most important thing is for the crew to know whose surveyor they are dealing with and be very careful not to disclose information to the opposite party surveyor because this information can be easily misinterpreted. Seafarers should understand that we are there to assist them, and our starting point is usually to identify what has been done prior to the incident and prior to our arrival. And before we get involved. So if things have been done in a diligent way, then that's quite useful. It saves me personally a lot of time on board and for preparing the relevant report as to the cause, nature, and extent of the contamination.
Yeah, Ivan, I think you in the previous slide you made a reference to the sample, the visual analysis of the sample. I think sometimes an AB or an OS might or might not have that level of experience that's required to form a good evidential chain to prove whether the sample is either on spec, off spec, or even a reliable sample. I want and one more thing. You clearly said that you're there, you go on board to support the crew and assist the crew and not do the job for them. Is this something that you're seeing more of? I mean, crew depending on the surveyor and asking you to lead the way.
Well, I have to say that it is getting better and better. Record keeping is getting better, taking sample is getting better, labeling is getting better, and this is all good for my job.
That's great. Fantastic news then. And Ben, when it comes to the use of independent surveys, their use must be really very positive when handling claims. Any thoughts?
Yes, Andy. I think it is very often that when a problem arises, there is a lot of pressure on the crew. An experienced local surveyor and correspondent can assist greatly in speaking the local language, providing support for the crew. Also, the surveyor may have local knowledge of the claims in that particular port. For example, whether and what common problems there are there. They might have just done a survey last week, with the same problem. So they might have local expertise, and that can help to assist and guide the crew in the investigation and the evidence preservation. Also, independent surveyors' findings are less likely to be criticized by the opponents.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I remember from my sailing days how important it is to have an experienced local surveyor at hand, as they can be of tremendous help. Thanks very much.
Okay, let's now have a quick look at some of the sampling points that we've been referring to in the last few slides. Shore tank sampling point, shoreline, manifold, and then the ship's tank itself. Ivan, over to you.
Thanks, Andy. Well, samples that can be drawn in relation to a single shipment of liquid cargo, and when we think about this throughout the whole logistics, it can be briefly described as pretty much as follows. I mean, shore tank samples prior to vessel arrival, shore tank samples on vessel's arrival and prior to the cargo transfer, and there may be shoreline samples drawn at the terminal or jetty on commencement of the transfer. Then we move on to the vessel, and we all know about the first flow manifold samples, and there may be also subsequent manifold samples prior to the first food sample. Then the very famous first food sample, sample on completion of the loading. In my experience, there may be also samples during the voyage at some intermediate port. Ship samples before the discharging, of course, and then we may have ship manifold and shoreline samples during the discharging and shore tank samples after the discharging, so quite a lot of samples.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much, Ivan. Ben, I know that in terms of shore samples, for example, you had something that you wanted to discuss on this and the access to shore tanks in particular.
Yeah, we see a lot of resistance from a lot of terminals to allow shoreside sampling, or where there's an issue, then you want to send somebody ashore. The terminal will give all sorts of different reasons. Nowadays, it's normally COVID, no access because of COVID. But even before COVID, we were seeing excuses coming from the terminal. So if there is a problem, let us know. We try and help to see whether we can get access or not.
Yeah, okay, I think that's an important point there. If members are having difficulties getting access, to get in touch with us as quickly as possible. Okay, moving on then to the manifold sample. We all know the importance of the manifold sample as the location where responsibility passes to the vessel. So it's a very important location to take a set of samples and set aside for future reference. Ben, I think you wanted to touch on this as well.
Yeah, if possible, the vessel should consider the proposed loading plan and decide how many sets of manifold samples are needed. Ideally, the vessel should take one set of manifold sample each time there's a changeover in shore tank or stoppage or something that might affect the source of the cargo. These should be properly labeled and retained. If you've got the right sample from the manifold, you know if the cargo that's come on board is already contaminated on board or not. And that can be a game changer in contamination claims. If the vessel expects this to be overwhelming for the crew, for example, there are too many grades of different cargoes, there are too many changeovers expected, then the owners may wish to consider engaging third-party surveyors to help the crew.
Yeah, that's a good point. Very interesting. Okay, I've seen photos of buckets containing sample bottles with samples but no labels on them. Ivan, do you see a lot of that sort of thing? Samples taken but not labeled?
Yeah, well, such buckets may cause a problem if the samples inside cannot be identified, of course. Labeling is important, and I have not come across any significant issues with labeling, but there are still issues with the way a sample is drawn representatively.
We hear lots of excuses why samples are not taken or why bottles aren't tagged at the right time. I guess you really need somebody to coordinate all of that as part of the cargo operations. We heard a couple of slides ago just how many samples you might have to take. Excuses are good, but they don't help when a claim comes along in terms of evidence.
Yes, and I also know that some terminals prevent vessels from taking manifold samples under the pretext of safety concern. I mean, this is something that Captain Ravi has mentioned about Dubai. If that's the case, then you need to protest it. You make it known to everybody that it is not acceptable, so that if there is later a problem and there's an argument that owners were prevented from taking the manifold samples, not because of the fact that you didn't do it, but because the terminal was the one who prevented you from taking it.
Yeah, sure. So letters of protest are really important. Also, if members are going to a new terminal where they've never been before, please do send an inquiry either to Andy and I in loss prevention or your contact and claims. We can always ask people on the ground what can be expected so that you at least can be forewarned before arrival. If you are faced with such a restriction, it's even more important that we have a good chain of evidence to prove due diligence of preparing the cargo tanks prior to arrival. So it's even more important that accurate and good quality tank cleaning records and tank cleaning inspections are maintained on board. Ben, what actually do you guys do to help resolve contamination claims?
I think especially for manifold samples, if they show that the cargo came on board contaminated, then it will assist to get the charterers on the owner's side to put commercial pressure on the shipper to help to mitigate the situation. Because the shipper has got a lot more control, and sometimes they are able to discharge the contaminated cargo ashore, reprocess it at a much lower cost and things like that. So the exposure for the claims is a lot lower.
Okay, cheers. Thanks for that. Okay, moving on to first foot samples then. I think we all know these are important, but perhaps, Ivan, you can expand on why this is the case.
Yeah, well, the first food sample is important because it should support the readiness of the vessel's cargo tanks and pipelines to receive the cargo. For sensitive cargoes, the first food sample should be also drawn ideally together with a series of manifold samples during the loading of the first food cargo itself. These manifold samples, they don't need to be retained if all is okay with the first food sample, but let's think about what happens if the first food is found to be out of specification, and how can we prove whether this was the ship or the shore. So irrespective of the fact that the first flow or the first manifold sample may have been within specification, the potential for a presence of a slug of contaminant from the shore during this period of time cannot be ruled out. One issue I would like to mention is the refusal to witness or participate in the ship sampling operation by terminals or cargo surveyors. They should not discourage the crew from doing basically their job. I would recommend just officially invite all relevant parties to participate in the sampling activity, describe what samples the crew intends to draw, maintain a detailed statement of facts logging any refusal on behalf of the terminal or the cargo surveyor to witness or participate in the sampling. We should not forget that they may not have instructions for that. Do not allow the terminal or third-party surveyors to walk about on board unattended. In the end of the day, when there is a number of bottles lined up at the manifold prepared by the crew for sampling, everybody will know that the crew takes this one seriously.
Yeah, thanks, Ivan. If you're taking a first foot sample, it's so important that it's assessed by somebody who's competent enough to be able to identify a problem with the cargo. If you've got a good first foot, good manifold sample, then that's got to be pretty strong evidence that you've prepared your vessel correctly for the carriage of the cargo in question. Ben, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, if the first food sample is on, then it's not a problem. The problem normally comes when the first food samples are tested and then it is off. So if that's done, then the next step is, of course, you test the manifold samples to determine if it is something that the vessel has caused. Depending on the nature of the cargo and the contamination, we often work very closely with cargo scientists such as those from Brooks Bell, who can then advise if it might be possible to reprocess or blend the cargo so as to mitigate the loss. I mean, this is assuming that the cargo came aboard damaged, and also if the cargo is only slightly off spec.
Ivan, can you briefly touch on other types of samples, just such as the running and the top, middle, bottom sample?
Probably the most important thing is to ensure that the sample is representative. And representativeness is when the portion extracted from the total volume contains the same constituents and in the same proportion that are present in the total volume in the tank. For a representative sample to be drawn or prepared, it is also important that the sampling material is homogeneous throughout the storage tank or when it is passing through a pipeline. Running or top, middle, bottom samples normally suffice for homogeneous cargo, but I manually obtained representative running samples, in my view, is quite challenging because it requires constant and steady speed of lowering and recovering of the sampling container, and this cannot be guaranteed by surveyors normally. The bottle also should always be retrieved within 70 and 80% fullness as required.
Thanks, guys. Interesting discussions. Before we move on to the Q&A session, we do have one last slide on storage. During the pandemic in 2020, we received several inquiries where members were asking about use of their vessels as storage tankers. Ben, would you like to provide a quick summary of our advice as a P&I club when it comes to prolonged storage when vessels are used as storage tankers?
Yes, Andy. I mean, I think we all know that every time the price of a commodity drops substantially, or there's a possibility that the price of the commodity will rise in the near future, someone somewhere will want to make money off it. For example, by storing the cargo and making money when the price goes up. So this is often known as the contango trade. If members wish to safely use their vessel to store cargo, the key point to understand whether such storage is contemplated under the contract of carriage. However, floating storage, especially long storage, certainly does bring with it some challenges and often many complications, let alone the increased exposure to the owner when the prolonged storage involves sensitive, high value and high impact cargoes such as jet oil. There are a lot of protective clauses out there And this is all contemplated before fixing a voyage when you're going to store the cargo. It becomes more of an issue when the vessel is already loaded with the cargo and then asked to store the cargo on board for a prolonged period. This is when the problem starts, because if you were to do that, then there's a big risk of deviation under the contract of carriage. And that contract of carriage will not, in that case, contain the protective clauses. Besides the legal implications of deviation, prolonged storage also increases the risk of cargo deterioration, especially for cargoes like jet. Andy, are you able to elaborate more on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, deterioration is something that we probably would be concerned about, especially in the long-term storage of cargoes like jet, for instance, which we saw quite a few members asking about. Cargo loss, for instance, through excess vapor loss through venting can also be a problem, more so in warmer climates. We had an inquiry where one of the members was inquiring about using a vessel as a storage tanker off the coast of California, where there actually is a ban, a complete ban on tankers venting at any point. Ivan, quickly, I can see the time. Can you quickly take us through a few practical aspects of what other issues members should be aware of when considering long-term storage on board tankers?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Sure. Yeah, well, a few areas of concern, of course, are the hull fouling, cargo care and monitoring during the storage time, emergencies, sediment management, for example, cargo heating or recirculation of the cargo. As you mentioned, the vapor loss, inert gas management and maintenance, then the necessity for extended crude oil washing for crude oils when discharged, pertinent routine maintenance, and we should not forget, of course, the engineering aspect and having a vessel not moving for a prolonged period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are indeed so many factors, other than the deterioration that a ship owner will have to keep into mind when considering long-term storage. And of course, we can always help members get in touch with local experts to find out what the risk is with a particular cargo. And before we move on to the Q&A, please do remember that most of you will know this already, but in case you don't, we literally have loads and loads of information on our website that members can benefit from. This information is free for members as long as you are a member and you've registered on the website. This is free for you all. So please try and use our resources as much as possible because they are meant for you.